Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Cook, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Council of Churches. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this seminar that we are holding on affordable housing. This is part of a series of seminars we are holding on a variety of public policy issues and legislation which will be coming before the 2023 New York State Legislature. So today our focus will be on affordable housing. And I'm just going to get into it immediately and introduce to you Laura Harding, who is the executive director of Erase Racism located on Long Island. So, Laura?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Peter, first of all, thank you for hosting and facilitating this important event so that we can really begin to think about how we move forward. Well, not begin, but actually develop an action plan for how we move forward. So I'm really excited. So today I wanted to just start off with a quote that's usually attributed to Elie Wiesel, but actually was cited by Martin Niemöller. And it says, first they came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the socialists and the trade unionists, but I was neither, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the Jews, but I was not a Jew, so I did not speak out. And when they came for me, there was no one left to speak for me. And to me, I think that that's actually an appropriate representation of what's happening with affordable housing on Long Island. For many of us and you all who've been doing this work for many years, we have been, a clarion call for the most vulnerable populations on the island, Black and brown peoples, those who are mentally challenged and differently abled, who have really sought to have fair and affordable and inclusive housing. And when you look at the history of Long Island and the fact that so many of its exclusionary zoning rules and laws and so many of the policies that prevent or are barriers to fair and affordable housing for so many of its residents are really steeped in a history of racism and the attempt to keep others out. Well, now those rules and policies that many people are still trying to hold on to are now coming home to harm the very people that they allegedly were meant to protect. And so what I urge us to do, what I urge all Long Islanders to do, because the issue of fair and affordable and inclusive housing is not just a Black and brown issue. Yes, it disproportionately impacts Black peoples and Latino peoples and the most vulnerable peoples. And yes, they're the ones who suffer the most. But at this point in Long Island's history, it's also affecting people who they thought it wouldn't affect, right? It's preventing young people who were born on the island from being able to have a family sustaining career, buy homes on the island, find places to rent. I tell the story of myself. I was recently appointed and I'm attempted to relocate to Long Island, and it is incredibly hard to find an affordable 2-bedroom for someone like myself with 3 degrees and a relatively, good income. And so as we begin to work towards really pushing policy and advocating for some of getting rid of the exclusionary zoning, as we begin to suggest to lawmakers that they really need to have an amnesty for people who may have illegal dwellings, that they really need to push for the legalization and the registering of accessory dwelling units, that they really need to look at how our exclusionary zoning rules are barriers, not only for our most vulnerable Black and brown people and mentally ill and differently abled, but also for the missing poor, the working poor of Long Island, who on its face appear to do very well, but are really suffering under taxes, under affordability, and the desire to want to have a better life for their child. It's impacting education and access to high quality education. It's impacting health. It's impacted access to services. And it's time that we stop reciting what's wrong about it, and we actually have a plan for action, and that we build capacity among communities that are affected to also advocate for themselves and push the legislature to do the right thing. Now is the time. And I think that now is the time for us, with all our varying stakeholders and who we represent, to come together with a plan for how we're going to make this happen. You know, it's not about anyone else in New York or upstate telling Long Island what to do. Long Island has the capacity and the ability and the desire to ensure that fair, affordable, and inclusive housing is available for everyone. And we, the collective, we here, and those who may be listening or may watch this later, have the ability to come together and ensure that we make that happen. And we don't need to recite the facts. We know the facts. We don't need to recite what the issue is. It's time for us to plan and implement and take action. And I leave you with that, and a happy holidays.
Okay. Thank you so much, Laura, for your reflections. I got to meet Laura at a recent conference in Long Island and was incredibly impressed with her knowledge and her analysis. So couldn't think of a better person to start off our seminar today. So I would now like to introduce to you Senator Brian Kavanagh, who is the chair of the Senate Housing Committee and has been a real fighter for affordable housing in the legislature for a very long time. And we're just so pleased you could be here today. And also Rachel Fee, who is the executive director of the New York Housing Conference, who just has an encyclopedic knowledge about the affordable housing space, and just has so many helpful thoughts that I wanted her to share with us today about legislation that's passed, current legislation, and pending legislation at the city, state, and federal level. So Senator Kavanagh, I'll start with you.
Great. It's really, really terrific to be with all of you today. And, just if we're going to tackle, a lot of us are really working hard, all of you and a lot of us in the legislature and all kinds of organizations working hard to really make New York a place where people don't lack a home because of an inability to pay, that everybody has access to high quality, affordable housing throughout the state. And, the churches and our religious institutions are going to play a big role, both in kind of figuring out how that happens on the ground, but also in advocating for that, really fundamental principle. So it's great to see all you. Great to see you, Peter. And also it's great to be with Rachel Fee, who does know much more about all of this than I'll ever know. So I look forward to hearing a little bit of her remarks as well. Just so briefly, we're at this, I think what a major moment. I go around and everybody said it's going to be a big year in housing, which I think is correct. Just to put a little, sort of context here, we got started in 2019 for the first time with Democrats controlling both houses of the legislature, and did the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which is the strongest piece of tenant protection legislation in the last half century anywhere in America. That's not hyperbole. And it, shored up the rent stabilization system and also provided new protections for people all over the state. 180,000 households in manufactured and mobile home parks got rent regulation for the first time and other protections. in the past couple of years, it really has been very much kind of emergency crisis mode with, we did a 22-month eviction and foreclosure moratorium. We did a program that is now totaling about $4 billion in rental assistance. And we're still trying to make sure that the, remaining applicants to that program get fully funded. We passed the hotel conversion bill first, Honda, which is a funding program, and then this year a bill to basically permit some regulatory flexibility that will permit conversions of hotels to permanent housing more easily. And that, of course, is a reflection, partly inspired by what's gone on during COVID, where, hotel capacity is just, there's been surplus hotel capacity because of changes in travel patterns. We also this year did a few bills expanding SCREE and DREE access, the senior citizen and disabled homeowner. Disabled renter increased exemption programs, and that is actually a theme I want to continue. We have these programs in existence that are intended to make sure people are not suffering rent poverty, and they are not nearly as thoroughly taken up as they should be, and also they're not as generous as they should be either. So that's an ongoing thing I'll be working on. We've also focused a lot on code enforcement in the last few years. We did a kind of investigation and analysis of code enforcement in localities around the state in 2019. The Senate passed a big package of bills in 2020. And then this past year, we also passed a package that was particularly focused on fire safety after, a couple of really horrific fires. That's something that I think we haven't gotten as much kind of bicameral cooperation on, but we continue to work on that. And I continue to believe that making sure that basic standards of habitability and services, making sure that that's the case throughout the state is really critical, and code enforcement plays a big role in that. And especially smaller localities don't have the resources to make that happen. So we need to continue to work on that. We also have done a lot on fair housing, and it's great to see, race racism here speaking. So we did a very robust package of bills that are intended to strengthen all the ways that the government investigates and enforces those things, provided some resources to the Attorney General and to the housing, HCR. And again, I think that's going to be a continuing theme. I think we don't do enough to enforce the laws. We don't do enough to educate people. And so looking into this budget, I think that's going to be an issue we're working on. And just beyond that, I mean, we now have both a governor and, for those of us in New York City, a mayor who have said, I think really for the first time unequivocally, that it is the responsibility of government to ensure that everybody has access to housing, and that they, as the chief executives, are going to take responsibility for that and make sure they put us on that path. The governor made that pronouncement most clearly at Rachel Fee's great meeting of the housing conference, and I think that's a really significant thing. I think we're going to differ a little bit on exactly what that means and what how you implement that, particularly how much spending we need to do. But I think it is really, I think that they're serious, and I think you're going to see very big proposals coming out of the executive. And I think the Senate in particular and the Assembly as well are really ready to engage with that and get a lot done. So we're talking about a lot of things to change the fact that localities have generally prevented housing from being constructed, especially rental and multifamily housing, but just housing production in general has lagged really severely in New York State, particularly in the New York metropolitan area, but really in the rest of the state as well. I'm going to be pushing the Housing Access Voucher Program, which is, again, I introduced it about a week before we all realized that COVID was going to consume so much of our efforts. But this is a program to create basically a fully state-funded Section 8 style rental assistance program to prevent people, to address the housing needs of people who are experiencing homelessness or people who are at imminent loss of their housing. And we want to do it at a scale that it really, shift the direction of that crisis. We have far too many people are homeless. Good cause eviction is very much on the agenda of a lot of us in the legislature. Again, this is the simple proposition that if you want to evict somebody, you can't do it for no reason. You need, if they're not paying their rent, or they're, unwilling to pay even a reasonable rent increase when the lease is up, that might be cause. But unreasonable rent increases, and certainly, complaining about your housing conditions and other things, or simply, under the current system, no reason at all, should not be the basis for an eviction. So we're working on that. We've got a lot of other things, but I want to, hear from all of you. So I'll end there. But just to say again, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and thank you for all of the work that all of you do in housing and in so many other areas.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh, and appreciate your reflections. And so, Rachel.
Thanks so much for having me, Peter. Happy to be here with everybody.
So go ahead. What do you think about what's been accomplished, and as we move forward with a legislative agenda?
So I think Senator Kavanaugh did a great job of kind of saying what's been happening, bringing us up to date, and then, what the outlook looks like. And I agree. I think it's going to be a really big year for housing in Albany. We're really excited about that. And it's the time to do it. We have an affordable housing crisis in this state. We have exclusionary zoning, as Laura pointed out, that has been a problem for decades, but I think it's really coming to a head now, where it's very clear that we have a supply shortage in the state. We're not building enough housing across the board, and where we're building it is not equally distributed. So I think thinking about bringing affordability to New Yorkers, we really do need to be building more affordable housing. And Governor Hochul and the legislature passed our largest affordable housing plan, but we still know that's not enough. And I think the way I'm thinking about this now is that we really need to extract everything we can from the private market in terms of affordable housing set-asides. We need to be encouraging the use of zoning and tax policy to make sure we're building more housing, especially regionally. And then we need to really be thinking about the lowest income New Yorkers who we know are never going to be able to afford the market. So programs like HAVP, providing rental assistance, are going to be critical and complementary to expanding housing supply. So we're really excited for what we anticipate will be in the governor's budget proposal. And I think she's thinking really big about how to approach this. So last year, we saw some initial proposals around transit-oriented development, which I think is so critical because it really is smart planning and also takes into consideration our climate crisis. So we need to always be considering that now when we're looking at housing development, how to do this in a smart way that is not contributing to global warming. So transit-oriented development, bringing density around mass transit is going to be, I think, a critical part of that. There's also things we can be doing like accessory dwelling units. Obviously, in New York City, we saw really tragic deaths after flooding. People trapped in basements, like trapped in subgrade apartments because that's all they can afford. So having a route to legalize what we can is also going to be really important. But I think in regions like Long Island, what Laura pointed out, like we have an affordability crisis there too. There are going to be some opportunities to add to our housing stock in a limited way through ADUs if we can get that to pass. Another really important aspect of this is just NIMBYism at the local level, trying to keep people out in these exclusionary communities. And something like a housing appeals board is really important piece of this puzzle, of acknowledging we're not building enough. It is a crisis. Our planning is not equitable, and having a process to appeal local zoning decisions that are really not moving in the direction that they need to. So I think those are some of the big things we're expecting in the governor's budget. She's also mentioned commercial conversions. I think that is, it feels like a common sense, easy to do thing, like let's convert the hotels, let's convert unused office space. When you dig into it, it is a lot harder to do in reality, but I do think we do need the legal pathways to get there. And this is really planning for a changing New York as well. We know people are not returning to offices in the numbers that they have in the past. And so looking at how do we revitalize these underutilized office corridors? How do we make them part of a livable city that is bringing people in, 24/7, living there, working there, enjoying life there in public spaces as well is going to be really important. So maybe I'll stop there. I think for those are the big things we're really excited for at the state level. I'm happy to talk about city and federal too.
Great. We'll come back to the city and federal, because that's also really an important piece of this picture. I wanted to ask one very pointed follow-up and specific question to both Rachel and Brian, and that is, we've made a set of recommendations to the mayor of New York about regulatory relief to help congregations repurpose their property to build affordable housing. It's my opinion that there is a ton of religious-based property on the market that could be used for affordable housing, but it's not going to happen unless those congregations have pre-development money that can help them hire an attorney and an architect that represents them and only them to enter into a negotiation either with the government if we want to say something like social housing, or with a private developer. Any chance that there could be some funds available for religious institutions to get that kind of pre-development help?
I will the short answer is yes. I would like to figure out how to work with religious institutions to sort of convert property they have to housing on their own terms, and make sure it makes sense for the congregations, as well as meeting the mission that it's intended for. We'd have to how what funding source might be available. I think we'd want to talk about. I'd want to take a look at existing resources. Whether some of the existing, sometimes we can use just general capital grants for stuff that is pre-development. But I'd like to hear more about exactly, and frankly, talk to our staff, our finance and council staff about what would be the best way to do that. But I'm certainly interested in working with you on that.
Great, thank you.
And I would just add on that, I think this is such an important time to think about property that is controlled, owned by religious institutions, and how to repurpose it. over the past 2 years, construction costs have gone up 25% across the US, even higher in New York. Plus, we have rising interest rates. We're looking at our affordable housing term sheets going 70, 80% over costs right now. When you add in the land costs, a lot of these deals are just not going to be feasible. So what you can bring to the table is something without the land costs. And I think it's really important to recognize that right now, that that is a huge asset. And so getting that assistance, you need technical assistance to figure out a development plan, is really in everyone's interest.
Okay,
Peter, I will just add that on the regulatory stuff, sometimes the state sometimes the city, when they want to do regulatory relief, they come to us and say, it's actually easier to pass a law in Albany, a law supported by the city, because sometimes our ability to change rules, the rules that you need to change, is just, more clearly established in law. So if we should talk about the regulatory changes you need as well.
great. And we want to share with you the report we shared with Mayor Adams, which is comprehensive, which of recommendations. So we should probably discuss that too.
Great.
So I want to give our friends from Right to Counsel the floor here, and then if there's any thought or reaction from Rachel and Brian about this, we would be grateful. Oh, sorry. You want to share a screen? Yes, just a minute. Katie, sorry.
And if I can just interrupt, this is a very tight morning for me. I may need to leave you all pretty soon. But I am a fan of figuring out how to make sure everybody has an attorney who's might be facing eviction or other serious consequences related to their house. I'll say that up front. But,
well, could I just ask if you could expand just slightly more on that? If you have to go, I just want to get that conversation going here with the Right to Counsel folks. Could you say more?
You want me to? Okay.
I just want to have the benefit of your reflection.
Yeah, I wasn't
on that.
I wasn't trying to take the floor back, but
no, that's fine.
The approach we've done so far is to put, we put some significant funding behind it. We did $35 million in the current budget for attorneys outside the city, for housing, for mostly for eviction prevention. It was $25 million 2 years ago, $35 million in this year's budget. We need to establish the capacity to do that. You can't, if you're a legal services organization and the legislature says there's money this year for you to hire up some people to protect people's housing rights, that's a difficult basis for a program. So we need to make sure that we're adequately funding it. And, Rachel May has this Right to Counsel bill, which is very, very broad. I think it's a combination of ensuring in law that when people are facing potential eviction, they have a right to counsel, and also making sure the courts and the legal services organizations have the actual capacity on the ground to realize that goal. I mean, if there are no attorneys that are available to be present when someone is facing eviction, it's going to be hard to effectuate the right. So I think it's very important. I think New York City, as in many of these areas, is somewhat ahead of, more than somewhat in this case, than the rest of the state. But we need to. It's something that we're interested in. A lot of us are committed to, and I think it is going to require greater levels of funding than we've been able to secure so far.
Okay. All right. So, Katie, I'm going to turn it over to you and Janet.
Good morning, everyone. Katie, whenever you're ready. Okay. So good morning again. My name is Janet Fry. I am the Director of Advocacy at the Community Resource Center. The CRC is located in Mamaroneck, New York, in Westchester County. So today I'm presenting the Right to Counsel NYC Coalition, a tenant-led coalition that formed in 2014 to change housing courts, prevent displacement, and stop the eviction crisis that threatens our families, our homes, and our neighborhoods. RTC NYC is made up of tenants, organizers, advocates, legal services organizations, and more. In 2017, after a 3-year grassroots campaign, the coalition won the right to counsel, making New York the first city in the country to establish the right to a free attorney for low-income tenants facing evictions. Next. In 2020, our coalition launched a statewide campaign called Housing Courts Must Change to transform courts across New York State from the eviction machines they currently are to places that hold landlords accountable, uphold tenants' rights, and enable tenants to remain in their homes. We have a 3-bill platform, but our priority legislation is a statewide right to counsel, bill numbers A7570, S6678, introduced by Senator Rachel May and Assembly Member Latoya Joyner, which guarantees all tenants across New York State the right to a free lawyer when facing evictions. The legislation will guarantee the right to a free attorney to tenants throughout the entire state, from Buffalo to Long Island. It will cover thousands of tenants in New York City who don't yet have right to counsel under our city law. The bill also covers any case that would result in a New Yorker losing their housing. This includes non-payment and holdover cases, harassment cases, repairs cases, public housing eviction cases, subsidy terminations, appeals, and more. We know that people are now just displaced through formal eviction proceedings, but are pushed out of their homes through a variety of legal and extra-legal means. So in this bill, we're trying to ensure that tenants, if they need to, can also take their landlords to court with the help of an attorney. Finally, right to counsel requires that the courts and judges ensure that tenants know about and can use the right to counsel. Housing court was actually created to protect tenants' rights, but now largely serves to help landlords make profit off of and exert their power over regular New Yorkers. So in writing this bill, we knew we needed to ensure that the courts and judges participate in upholding right to counsel. So why are we fighting for this bill? Everyone here knows that we are in a long-term devastating housing crisis. Rents are skyrocketing, landlords across the state are evicting and displacing New Yorkers, and most tenants do not have the means or the rights to defend themselves in court from these injustices. Right now, there are nearly 270,000 active eviction cases across New York State. 92,000 New Yorkers are experiencing homelessness, and that's likely an undercount. Across the state, the majority of eviction cases are initiated by landlords, and almost all landlords have lawyers in eviction cases, while most tenants do not. For example, in the third quarter of 2022, only about 1.3% of tenants in Albany eviction court had an attorney, compared to 92 to 94% of landlords. Last year, even with a blanket moratorium on evictions, 5,229 warrants of eviction were issued across New York State. As of December of 2022, over 40,000 warrants had already been issued by the city and district courts across New York State. The good news is that a statewide right to counsel is one of the most effective solutions in preventing evictions, and it is a crucial tool that will help us relieve this crisis. In places where RTC has been established, this right has proven to stop evictions and keep tenants in their homes. As you can see in the local and national statistics up on the screen, right to counsel helps tenants win their cases and remain in their homes, reduce evictions overall, reduce evictions filings, When landlords know that tenants have a right to counsel, they are clearly less likely to bring cases they know are not supported by the law. They are less likely to use and abuse the court systems to profit off of tenants and exert their power over us. And finally, right to counsel reduces default evictions, which means more tenants show up in housing court to fight their cases. Right to counsel is also a smart fiscal investment that will bring millions of dollars of cost savings to New York State. Right to counsel creates more positive economic impacts and cost savings than the cost of providing legal representation, meaning it will pay for itself. In fact, the financial firm Stout has found that for every dollar invested in right to counsel, New York State will save $3 to $6. This is because right to counsel stops evictions, displacements, and homelessness before they happen. Instead of paying millions of dollars on shelter and emergency room costs, homelessness services, and more, we can spend less money on representation and prevent harm to New Yorkers. This year, in addition to urging New York State leadership to pass a statewide right to counsel, we're also campaigning to fully fund the first year of a statewide right to counsel's implementation in the fiscal year 2024 budget. Our New York communities need long-term solutions that will keep us safe and securely housed. To prevent displacement and keep New Yorkers in their homes, we're calling for the New York State to allocate $172 million in the fiscal year 2024 budget, which will enable guaranteed legal representation for tenants facing evictions across the state, expanded infrastructure outside of New York City to empower more tenant-initiated cases, growth of community organizations that provide tenants' rights education and tenant organizing. And finally, this funding will enable the creation of the Office of Civil Representation, which will oversee right to counsel's implementation and help legal services providers determine and enact effective strategies to attract, train, and retain new talent. I hope you all help us fight to pass and fully fund a statewide right to counsel this year. Thank you especially to the New York State Council of Churches for hosting us today and for championing this legislation. If you have any questions about our coalition, our campaign, and legislation, please get in touch with us. Thank you.
Nice job.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janet, for that comprehensive overview. I had hoped that we would have somebody here could speak to good cause eviction and also to the question of social housing. I don't think we have that person on. Let me just share quickly what I know about that, and then let's have a time for questions about that. So Brad Lander yesterday at a housing conference laid out sort of a three-part framework around housing. First is prevention and focused on good cause eviction and right to counsel, and also expansion of the housing access voucher program. So, and then the second is really a call for a large amount of production of new affordable housing, and and using every tool at our disposal to produce housing, particularly for people who are low or very low income. And then the third really has to do with social housing, where there's ideas like allowing tenants to be able to take over their property and own it. Setting up a housing authority, a separate agency that would really introduce social housing, which is really government run and subsidized to help people sort of live into what we see in Europe, for instance, where there's much longer time horizons of sustainability, being able to stay in their homes in perpetuity instead of the sort of the tax credit finance system, which has a sunset on how long housing can be affordable. And so this is all part of a package. I think there is in that coalition some skepticism about the private housing affordable market, and just to name that tension. All right, so questions. Let's take some time for questions. And
Peter, if I could
go
ask a
ahead.
question, I
Yeah.
wanted to ask Rachel. Rachel mentioned a local housing discrimination review board or something like that. It's the first time I've heard of that, and it's a great idea. It really talks about how, as a city, we have an obligation to take a look at what our neighborhoods are doing and review if we think they're in the interest of the larger whole. Maybe you could tell us a little more about that. That's something I'd never heard of, and I'm always so happy to learn so much from you, Rachel, all the time.
So Senator May has a bill, and I know Erase Racism has been involved in the formation of that legislation, along with Enterprise Community Partners and others working in an affordable housing, fair housing coalition. And the bill does a little bit more. It's calling for a fair share approach across New York State to make sure we have more equitable development and that we're meeting our housing needs, but also recognizing the structural racism embedded in our zoning policies and establishing a new state body, which would be an appeals board. So if communities keep saying no, and are not providing any housing opportunity, which creates an exclusionary zone basically of status quo, there would be an appeals process. And I think it is something that we should be looking out for in the governor's state of the state. I think it would be a really bold step forward in confronting what we know is not working today and is very hurtful to people who need housing and discriminatory. It's something, we would be really supportive of. I imagine it will be a difficult thing to get through the legislature. I mean, that's right. I mean, the legislature is not easily going to say, okay, we give away local control of zoning. But I feel like I'd love to see more about like where the governor will stand on this.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
the
If I could-
governor.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the mayor, New York City mayor and Governor Hochul put out this new New York plan. And I believe that there's reference to it in the plan. So I actually that just happened this week and I have to look at it more closely, but I believe that there's some indication that they're moving in that direction.
Yeah, if I could just respond to that. I was out at a synagogue in I forget, the North Shore of Long Island. Wonderful people. When I mentioned the accessory zoning idea, there was a lot of resistance. Obviously, I said if someone has a 2-acre lot and we want to put a little, home on that property, then doesn't that make sense? And actually yesterday at the conference, the Interfaith Center conference, someone mentioned, someone may have a caregiver that they count on to take care of an elderly parent or something. And that caregiver now has to travel, half an hour, an hour and a half to come and visit them. And then wouldn't make sense if the person lived on site? But there's a lot of resistance among the folks at the synagogue. And my point is that it would be, the faith community can help change the vision of the way we live as community members, and how we can live together, how we don't have to be fighting each other, but we need each other. So I think, there's always the carrot and the stick approach. Certainly the stick is, you better do this or else you're going to pay. The carrot is, wouldn't life be sweeter if we could find a way to support each other, to live together when we need each other? So I just think it's so important to take a look at what the faith community can do in changing our sense of what we can be as people, and really presenting a vision that really incorporates the belief that we all have, that we are all in effect one family and we can live together, and we just have to listen to each other. So, but I love the idea of, challenging ourselves for what kind of communities do we want,
Right.
and what's fair, right?
Right. And I think you all have a really important role to play in sort of setting that narrative, and in terms of community and equity. And I think also the example you give, it's at that single property level of like, neighbors are going to complain because they don't want you to convert your garage, but it's also excluding multifamily housing generally, right? I mean, that's like, when I look at it, that's the bigger problem. Even as we're putting in transit investment, expanding the Long Island Railroad capacity, bringing in East Side access, so that's a quicker journey, and the existing residents will benefit from those transportation investments, but we're not matching it with housing policy to really build out housing to meet that capacity. So I think it comes back to good planning in the state of New York as well, and really planning for equitable growth. I see a lot of hands up here, Peter.
Okay.
Peter, I think Pamela
Okay,
had her hand
yeah,
up
go
first.
ahead. I can't see who's raised their hands, so.
Pamela had her hand up first.
Oh, okay, Pamela, please, go ahead.
Peter, good morning, and thank you both for hosting the event today. I'm a BIPOC developer, just starting through the HCR program, and it's really a wonderful program to allow diversity in the development space. One of the questions I had regarding Rachel's conversation about the statewide appeals board, one of the yellow flags that came to my mind is Houston, where you lack local control, and you then have the large corporations having the ability to reach down and put their commercial refineries in residential spaces and pollute urban areas too. So whatever we do regarding that type of appeals board that reduces local control, I would ask that those decision makers keep that in mind and balance it out, because you are losing local control, and it may have some adverse impact that you aren't really thinking of at this point. That's all I had to share right now. Thank you.
I think what's on the table is a housing appeals board. I don't expect we see major changes to zoning across the board, but I do expect we could see incentives to create changes to allow more housing. So I think a housing appeals board passing is going to be a really heavy political lift. But I think it will start this conversation of we need better zoning policies in place across the state to build more housing generally. But I think that's a very important point, Pamela.
Hey, Peter, it's Laura.
I'm just to our questioners, I want to just be sure that you have short questions
Yeah.
so that we can allow time. So that's great. So Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I wasn't actually gonna, I don't actually have a question. I was gonna make a comment about two
Okay.
things. And one is really the narrative, making sure that we are clear about what we are saying about it, because I think that we keep responding to the objections and letting those people control how we frame the issue. And I also think about specifically on Long Island, for example, the fact that there are different levels of concern, right? There are people who already have illegal dwellings or accessory dwelling units, and you know it because they have Airbnb, they have renters, et cetera, et cetera. And how do we gather them in a block? And then there are people who really are resistant to what they perceive as new development that will change the texture of their locality and their community. And how do we really, I think, advocate and work with them to understand what the pluses are? So I think that as we continue this conversation, we want to be mindful about the narrative we develop, how we are controlling what's being said. And I think to Mark Greenberg's point, how we bring people along in a way that allows them to feel heard and to feel like they have a place in this legislation and in this conversation as we push them toward being more open about what affordable housing looks like for their specific communities.
It's a good point, Laura. And I think there's a lot of coalition building that needs to happen. I do think a little bit of a shift has happened, that it's not just New York with, New York City is expensive anymore, right? Affordable housing is a crisis across the state, across the nation. And so I do feel like there is a little bit of that narrative change happening. Freddie Mac, for example, published this year that we have a 3.8 million housing supply shortage across the nation. We've built 5.5 million fewer housing units in the past 20 years than we did in the previous. All of this is having an impact. And one of the impacts is inflation, which every elected in Washington is really concerned about, right? Because it's impacting who controls government, what voters are doing about that. But housing costs contributed to 40% of core inflation. So this is an issue that's really hitting home for everybody now. And I do think people are connecting the dots on, we have to add to our supply.
Okay, Shauna Williams, do you have a question? Yes.
Hi, yes. Hi, Peter. This either goes for yourself or Rachel. How can we expand on social housing and maintain a sense of community, religion, and culture? Because me personally, I've lived in, say, 3 types of establishments. I've lived in what they deem as public housing here in New York City. I live in an apartment now, and my parents own a home, and it is like a conjoined type of unit, but it's 4 homes in a row. So how can we expand on social housing that it benefits everyone on a broad spectrum or a larger scale? Because someone just mentioned Texas, we have, issues going on with the border and everything like that. But if you look in places like Hawaii, they just had a volcanic explosion. So if we're not monitoring certain things and people are doing things inadvertently or have behavioral health issues, how can we tackle social housing? Because I think it's something that needs to be separate. If I could take my apartment and have it as a house right now, I think I would be set. But it's because, it's a walk up. There are a lot of dynamics. And Rachel mentioned materials. How can we recycle? How can we create like a better type of living, or narrative, because in the 1800s, New York State was basically farmland. So everything that we see now was probably not established, besides the churches that we have. So how can we like get a definitive answer to say, this would be it, like as it pertains to social housing? Because I think everyone just needs an individualism, no matter your income bracket. So how can we expand on social housing?
Okay. So thank you, Shauna, for this. The word social housing gets thrown around a lot, but I don't think we're very good at defining what that is and what its place is in terms of the overall housing plan, and wanted to know if Rachel, you might offer some clarifying remarks on that, or any of the other panelists. Yeah.
Sure. So I think Shauna hits on many good points in her question. There's definitely a growing movement of people that share your concern, Shauna, that are saying, I want community ownership over my housing. This is a priority. I don't want to be held to the whims of the market, and want this also to have some sort of community shared ownership aspect to it. So, I mean, when I think about this issue, the main thing is public investment, right? That's what it would take. And I think what we've seen in the past is also public investment at scale, right? Like those are the two pieces. So in the past, I think we've had more available publicly controlled land to build on, which would certainly make a large scale initiative more feasible. And then, a commitment, and I really think that it's not a commitment that can just happen at the city or state. It has to be a commitment of the federal government to really invest at scale. And sadly, we haven't seen that. We saw, the last, major housing assistance we received from the federal government was the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, ERAP, helping renters who lost income in the pandemic. Moving forward, I think with Republicans taking control in the House, we're kind of back to this awful dynamic of divided government, fighting over resources. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to reduce spending at the federal level. And both the city and state are looking at deficits in upcoming years. So I feel like that's like a terrible response to your question, which had a lot of hope in it. But I think continuing to work in coalitions to push for social housing is going to be really important. I think that movement has made a lot of noise, has a lot of elected officials on their side, and, is coming up with a lot of concrete policy solutions. But I think what has to come together is a plan at scale and investment.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to conclude the Q&A at 11:10. So we have 4 minutes, and I'm going to go to Peter next. Peter Peters next, who has his hand up. And there's 2 questions in the chat, and then I also see Mark's hand up. So quick, short questions. Great.
Thank you, Peter. Let me introduce myself. I'm chair of Reach Advocacy Inc. in Rochester, New York, and we are concerned about the lack of supply of supportive housing at truly affordable costs. I've been listening to this conversation, and I would like to learn more from Rachel about what kinds of coalitions exist that we could join to help change the narrative around housing, too much of the narrative around housing is about the market, and housing prices that are driven by market costs are unaffordable to so many people. And a lot of the people we deal with in Reach Advocacy are people at the margins of our culture. I endorse very strongly what Mark Greenberg said, is that faith communities have an opportunity to change narratives. We live by narratives, and we can change the narrative. And so maybe a coalition of us could start talking about public housing as a response to the crisis that we're facing throughout the state. My focus is on upstate concerns. And when we talk about, I thought there was an interesting comment by Rachel about the building at scale. We're doing a small tiny home village in Rochester. We've just had access to the land granted to us. This was a vacant lot in the middle of the city. Maybe we should start looking at the way we use vacancies and vacant land and repurposing them for housing that meets the needs of a population that currently is not being met. Their needs are not being met. Anyway, that's my kind of comment.
All right.
There's a lot in there, but I think for coalition building, I think this group here is doing some great work, is being vocal. I'm seeing Peter and Mark in all of my housing meetings. So there is a presence, that voice, keep elevating it. It's really important. And there is, I think, a tough dynamic where the programs that we can expand, and Peter, I think you alluded to this at the start, are really leveraging the market to build housing. And then there is some tension with this vision for what is a more community-based social housing model. So I feel like in the short term, if we're not there at the social housing model, it's important for everyone to be advocating for the resources we do have. So for example, right now, we are trying to get a change in Congress to the low-income housing tax credit. It's called reducing the 50% test. It would allow us to use our private activity bonds that the state has to double affordable housing production. So this is what finances supportive housing, senior housing, low-income affordable housing in the state right now. So I'd be happy to follow up after this and give you emails and an email to send out to Senator Schumer specifically. Like, that's the kind of help we need. But those are the tools we have right now. So it's not perfect, it's not ideal, but it would help us finance more affordable housing. I don't know if I answered your question.
Let me just say, that was what I was going to ask Rachel about. So if you could give us that link, because clearly there's a very short window to go out to ask Senator Schumer to do something that he can now do, which he won't be able to do next year. So please give us the link and let's push that thing, because that little change makes a massive difference when we when we can make the difference. You have to drink when the well is running or something, whatever that is. Make hay when the sun is shining.
Yeah, so the main financing tool for new construction of affordable housing is the low-income housing tax credit. And right now, the federal government caps how many credits can be issued. There are two programs in the tax credit. The main program is called the 4% low-income housing tax credit. It's so technical and wonky. But basically, if we can change the rules around how the state allocates bonds for multifamily housing, we can double affordable housing production. And that affordable housing is only eligible for low-income housing. It's typically dedicated to supportive housing, senior housing, and low-income affordable housing for families. So we would love help pushing Senator Schumer. As I mentioned, we're going into a divided Congress in January, so this could be our last time to expand housing resources. So even if it's not your preferable model. It's our only chance at expanding resources right now, and we'd appreciate any help.
Okay, I'm going to just skim off the last two questions. I'm just going to pick them up on these folks' behalf. And one has to do with Section 8 and vouchers. And you said it's a pretty dim prospect, I think, in Washington. But I want to ask again your kind of thoughts on expanding vouchers.
So
That
it
would be
has to
another one.
continue to be a high priority of universal rental assistance, and really pushing for that vision that everybody who needs help can get help affording their rent to prevent homelessness, especially. So we will keep pushing for expansion of vouchers. It's going to be difficult when, we're anticipating that the focus in Washington is going to shift to, fights over the budget. It's worth noting that Representative Hakeem Jeffries, who will be, leading the Democrats in the House, did co-author an op-ed with me 2 years ago, calling to move Section 8 and Section 9 public housing to the mandatory side of the budget, meaning let's make these entitlement programs that we're not fighting over discretionary budget every year, and take this out of the political process. So it's great that we know he is a champion of affordable housing and really wants to see big change there. But I think he's, entering a position of it'll be leading the minority in the House. He's not really going to be able to implement a vision, but we do expect him to fight for housing.
Okay. I know.
And sorry, I will say I shouldn't be so pessimistic, because we have seen in the past Democrats and Republicans specifically expand vouchers for homeless populations. It's not the most equitable approach, because you're just picking kind of one favorite criteria to give housing assistance to. But for example, we've seen significant investment around veterans, Section 8 for veterans with supportive services in the VASH program. We've also seen investment for family unification vouchers. So I think we can still push for opportunities like that to expand Section 8, but it might be more targeted.
So I know that there are some other questions in the chat, but I do want to move on. We're going to return to all of them, I promise. But I want to move on to some specific topics now. Charles King, Executive Director of Housing Works, is just doing amazing work to help people with AIDS secure housing, but has really run into many obstacles. And I wanted Charles to have you sort of make your case here.
Surely. Thank you so much, Peter, for the opportunity to share around housing for homeless and inadequately housed people living with HIV and AIDS. So first of all, why is it important to ensure that people living with HIV have adequate housing? Well, there's three very important reasons. First of all, people with HIV who are housed are far less likely to engage in high-risk behaviors likely to transmit the virus to other people. Oftentimes when people are homeless, sex for housing, sex work, and other types of activities become a part and parcel of their circumstances. But the second and third reasons that housing is so important is that we now have effective treatment for HIV. If someone is on antiretroviral drugs and continues on those retroviral drugs, they become virally suppressed. And what that means is not only are they going to live a much longer and healthier life because the disease will not progress in their own body, but if you're virally suppressed, you cannot transmit HIV to anyone else through sexual activity. So it's really critical if we want to end HIV as an epidemic in New York State to ensure that every single person living with HIV has access to adequate housing. So in the late 1980s, the New York State legislature did pass legislation that was intended to provide housing for people living with HIV, with the typical state locality split in the cost of money. However, that housing was capped at $480 a month. Literally, you cannot go over $480 a month and receive the state contribution. In addition, the individual would be required to contribute from their own income down to until they only had a public assistance level of income. Needless to say, even back when this legislation was passed, very few areas of the state had housing, rental housing available at that price. And so very little has been done outside of New York City. New York City, always for people with AIDS, paid well above the price, though they did take folks from folks' own income in order to do that. In 2014, Governor Cuomo made a commitment to ending HIV as an epidemic by 2020. He established a task force to develop a blueprint. I co-chaired that task force, and we made housing a top priority for all people living with HIV. In 2016, the legislature passed legislation capping New York City residents living with HIV at a contribution of 30% of their total income towards their rent. And then by a change in regulation, Governor Cuomo expanded housing access in New York City alone to all people living with HIV who are public assistance eligible. As a consequence, in New York City, over 30,000 households receive enhanced rental assistance that pays up to 110% of fair market rent for whatever size apartment you need for your family. And as a consequence, we have very few people in New York City who are undomiciled living with HIV, and consequently we have a much higher rate of retention in care and viral suppression than in other parts of the state. For several years now, the Cuomo administration and then last year's budget under Hochul put in what ostensibly would have expanded housing access to the rest of the state, but made it optional to localities and put a heavy burden on localities to pay for the cost of this. And as a consequence, even though this legislation has passed every year for the last 4 years, not a single dime of the money appropriated has been spent to house people living with HIV outside of New York City. So this year we are calling for something fully, completely different. We're basically calling for OTDA, so change in the OTDA legislation that would require OTDA to pay rent for people living with HIV outside of New York City, up to 110% of fair market rent, which is the same rule that applies for Section 8 and other housing voucher systems, and that the tenant contribution to that rent would be capped at 30% as it is in New York City, and that the localities' share be limited to what would have been their share with the original 480, with the state picking up the difference of the cost. So that sums it up, Peter. I'm happy to answer any questions. I hope this wasn't too technical, but that's really what we're pushing to make happen this year. We do have the support of Dan Teets, who is the commissioner for OTDA, also the support of Joanne Moore, who oversees the agency in New York. We really need to buy-in from the governor and the division of the budget to make this happen.
Okay. Yeah, I think that there's just this incredible inequality. The New York City, program is pretty successful, but partly that's because the city itself brought extra subsidy to the program, but this is not really possible in other localities where they need the state to offer more support.
If I may interject here on that point, Peter, I should have mentioned this. There are two reasons why New York City can do this with largely relying on its own resources. First of all, New York City receives its own federal appropriation from the Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS Act. There is a state appropriation, but that goes to the AIDS Institute. It does not go to the localities. And the second reason, obviously, is New York City has its own income tax base, which is not available to almost any locality outside of the city.
Okay. All right, I'm going to move along. We're on topics here. Laura Harding from Racism. You've alluded to some of these things before in your previous remarks, but I wanted to know if you could really zero in on specific zoning issues, maybe looking at the dynamic on Long Island in particular, and that might include also your comments on what happened with the accessory dwelling unit proposal from the governor and why that was turned back. Laura? Laura, are you there? Oh, you might have lost.
I think she left. I'm not sure. I think she left.
Okay, well, we'll move along. We'll come back to this. So the next things I wanted to talk about was repurposing a religious property for affordable housing. I actually posed that question earlier when Senator Kavanaugh was on the line with us. But again, I'll just, for brevity, just re-emphasize that in every part of the state, there is a lot of religious property that could be repurposed for affordable housing. But what has happened is that you have developers come along and kind of wave money in front of congregations who don't know what they're doing and end up with arrangements that are not what seem to be promised. And this results in deals falling apart or people losing trust in the development community. And so we just can't say enough that some developers, if they see naivete on the part of the people applying, they can take advantage of that. So if we can have funds that are unencumbered, that help congregations get the expertise they need to really enter into a responsible conversation with the developer, that is really kind of critical. And we've laid out a process very specifically on how to do that. It's on iahcny.org. And in some cases, we are able to provide forgivable pre-development money up to $30,000 to congregations to secure the legal and architectural and appraisal help they need before they sign any agreements. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rob Crowderoof, who's going to talk a little bit about his partnership with the New York State Council of Churches on clean energy, particularly as it relates to affordable housing developments. So, Rob?
Thank you, Peter. And I apologize. I don't sound great, but the news I have is pretty optimistic. So, we have a partnership with the New York State Council of Churches to help affordable housing providers with their clean energy needs, especially as it relates to solar. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the new opportunities. It is a new world for solar, the Inflation Reduction Act, which now allows affordable housing providers to get up to 40 to 50% tax credits and to have those tax credits refunded by the IRS, by the federal government. This fundamentally changes the economics of projects, makes a lot more sense to own. It is not as sensible to bring in third parties for basically an energy services contract than it used to be. And the returns can be far better. We're looking at returns ranging from 3 to 7 years. So it is now a valuable component of an affordable housing preservation strategy. I will also say that these federal resources can be paired with state funding NYSERDA has. They have generous grants that are able to reduce the capital cost of projects. And there are some friendly lenders who are nonprofits and are able to support these projects as well. We have as I was saying, we have a collaboration, Peter, and the Council of Churches to provide free technical assistance funded by NYSERDA for any interested affordable housing provider. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I could just build on this if there's anybody in this network who knows of a landlord or people who own affordable housing property that would like to convert to clean energy, to have them please give us a call, because we do have the expertise to kind of walk them through that process. And Rob has a degree from MIT and has done this very successfully in many parts of the state. We're starting to now look into other states like Rhode Island to be able to offer this benefit. So we can walk you through it, and we won't look like shysters trying to sell you something at the farmer's market. Because the solar space can sometimes be a little complicated to navigate. Okay, I see Laura is back now. Hi, Laura.
I had some issues, so thank you.
Okay, not to worry. Laura, my question to you was, if you could reflect very specifically on zoning issues on Long Island and sort of the racist underpinnings of NIMBY in that context.
Yeah.
And I would be, curious about any proposals you have for increasing home ownership and wealth building, and
Yeah.
any reflections on why the governor's proposal to make it possible to do accessory dwelling units across the state was so vehemently resisted by people on Long Island.
Yeah. Oh, that's a lot. So let's start with the, I think, accessory dwelling units. I think that what you hear a lot of, well, one, there's the politics of Long Island and the rest of the state, right? And we can't negate what that means. But I think the other piece is when you think of accessory dwelling units, much of the resistance you hear from local Long Islanders are you want to change the nature of our communities. And it's also someone telling them what to do with their locality, right? And this idea of losing the power of their voice. But yet, there's so many accessory dwelling units that exist on the island. I'll give you an example. I've been staying in Airbnbs across Long Island since I've got back here just to learn more about the community and the various communities and experience them and decide where I want to live, right? And these are in people's homes that could function either as accessory dwelling units or that can function very much as a form of additional housing, right? And affordable housing for people. So I think there's a sense of really people feeling a local infrastructure may not be able to sustain more people feeling that the tone of their neighborhood will change. And I do want to say, at the risk of, I'm just going to say it. I think the other piece is that when people think about fair and affordable housing, they tend to think of poor Black and brown peoples. They tend to think that you're asking them to bring Black and Latino people who are going to bring crime and who are going to really impact their community in a negative way. I don't think that, and I think we have to address that. I think we have to address the inherent racism that is in that and what that means about how we picture who the poor are and what and the type of people that they are. I think we have to be real about that. And I'm just going to call it out. I'm not going to hide it and make it sound sweet. I think the other thing we have to help people understand is that there are also poor white people who are impacted, and that there are also working people who may be above the poverty limit but they can't afford a affordable place to live because it is so prohibitively expensive. And I think we have to bring all of those people together to kind of push this through. And I think on Long Island, the voices that tend to be amplified and organized are the voices that are anti a lot of this legislation that are going through. So there's a level of community and organizing and capacity building that we have to focus on around accessory dwelling units. As it pertains to home ownership, I think that for Erase, we are committed. I think that a lot of home ownership and how to get people into home ownership focuses on credit, focuses on programs, both at the state and federal level, focuses on the people who are trying to become homeowners. But it doesn't really, they don't really focus on the banks and some of the ways that banks exclude people, right? We've seen, we're not really making any structural changes to how loans are being decided upon and who gets the loan and that sort of thing. And I think there has to be a focus on that. We also, based on Newsday's work that they've done around the real estate world, you see how discrimination is still there in terms of how people are steered towards certain communities. And, you know, we haven't even talked about appraisals and that sort of thing. So I think when it comes to home ownership, there has to be a real question around what needs to happen with the banking industry, and not just this push to inform, to make people more credit worthy to own homes. I also want to flag that what's important for Erase as we think about, and it's something Rachel talked about, as we think about fair and affordable housing, and I think the senator talked about, is enforcement. We have federal laws and policies, we have local laws and policies, and we have, in some senses, very few protections for people who are already renting apartments and who are not living in great housing, and we're not really enforcing them. So I think there's a three-prong approach to this. There's the community outreach and organizing and capacity building locally. There's taking control of the narrative and being very clear about how we're able to amplify their voices. There's the enforcement side of making sure that laws and policies that are on the books are already enforced. And when we talk about for rentals, and when we talk about home ownership, there's the piece of how do we really not just focus on making people credit worthy and giving them access to grants and helping them fill out forms. You know, I've been speaking with a local bank about an opportunity to really help applicants complete grant applications where they can get money to buy homes. But there's also a real question around how do we work to ensure that the banking industry is not continuing to be discriminatory and making it more challenging for people to access loans and mortgages for home ownership. Did that answer all your questions?
I think so. Yes, thank you. That was really good. So there's one other topic which got surfaced in the chat, and maybe I'm going to ask my friend and colleague Chibuze Okori to talk about the particular challenges for people who are formerly incarcerated finding housing. Chibuze, would you mind just giving us a little bit about that? If you're there still.
I'm here. One of the challenges that affect those I work with who are returning citizens from prison are housing. You know, they come back home from prison with no likelihood of support, no job, and they are required to have housing by the parole board. So my questions here is, how can we be able to help this group of people who are coming home from prison to have accessible housing opportunity, and also to eliminate the number of homelessness in our communities? Because some of them who cannot find a place to live, the only alternative they have is to go and live on the street. So how do we include them to make sure that they have accessible housing, regardless of having vouchers that most landlords don't accept? And some of them have vouchers they can not make use of it until it expires and they become stranded. Even some people hope they're still in prison where they have free housing and under that kind of atmosphere. Being a prisoner, it's a little bit good that I have a house in prison and they're coming home, I cannot find housing. Why should they be released then? And why are they going through what they're going through right now? You know, they can't find a place to call their own homes.
All right. Okay, well, so Rachel, we put a lot out here, and I'm kind of curious if you could, pick up on some of these topics that were shared and offer some closing kind of reflections. Is there anything that you heard here that might reshape the governor's housing plan as she's going to roll that out, or are there other kinds of responses that you might like to offer?
So, I mean, I feel like a lot of ground was covered on a lot of really big topics. I just want to speak to Chibuze's comment. I feel like it's an absolute failure of public policy, and it's really going to require ongoing advocacy to not just break down barriers of allowing landlords to discriminate against people with a criminal justice record, but also really looking at public policy that allows somebody to leave prison and go straight into shelter. And we have rules that are saying you're not considered homeless until you enter that shelter and are there for some period to prove you're homeless, even if you're coming from prison or jail. And it just seems like, we should be thinking more about the outcomes we're looking for as a society. If we want that person to return to society and be successful and prevent recidivism, like putting them in a situation of homelessness is not, the right thing for a successful path. So I do think there is more discussion and awareness of this issue and focus on this population, but it's not enough, and we have a long way to go. And then I feel like Laura made so many good points, including around home ownership and the continued barriers we see to not just looking at someone's ability to build their credit, but get that loan at the end. And I feel like every year we're still seeing these, if it's an expose by Newsday or a report of this discrimination is still happening and widespread in 2022. So that's something that we all have to keep fighting against. But maybe to bring it back to what's happening on the positive side, we have a governor who I feel like is really drawn a line in the sand and is saying we're going to do things differently. So this is a huge opportunity, especially around land use this year, to really get behind policies that make sense and will make our state more equitable and build more housing. So I think that is a really positive thing. I would say for this group especially, really thinking about that person at the bottom of the income scale in New York. They're always left out. No matter what we do in the market, it's never going to be enough for our most vulnerable neighbors who are always going to need us to advocate for them. So maybe I'll leave it there. I think you have powerful voices to add to this conversation. You're doing great work, Peter, not just bringing people together to talk about this issue, but really following through in your advocacy and engaging the faith community to have a voice and make that voice heard. So I would say just, keep doing what you're doing and keep up this great involvement.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. So we have just about 10 minutes more for any other questions. I know that there were a couple of questions earlier in the chat, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to juggle up through these. If you posed a question in the chat that has not yet been answered, could you speak up now? I see Marianne Marianne might have had a question particularly.
Yeah, that's and I did have a question, and actually Rachel did respond to it. But it was, I'm in a very small, I mean, I'm in the Bronx, so it's in New York City, very, in the Bronx. And we started an initiative after the Twin Parks fire. And I'm at a Presbyterian church there, but this is this organization, this little coalition is interfaith, and it's also not just religious community, it's also community organizations. But we're working very locally, using the Twin Parks fire as a taking off point for the intersection of racism and housing, and particularly and why was that fire happen? Was it preventable if things had been better? The apartments had been better maintained and whatnot. And so we've gone through one project, but I was thinking about what might a small group be involved in, take on locally. And I did say that advocacy was maybe a possibility, but I'm looking for any suggestions of thoughts that people might have about what we might, ideas about what we might think about looking into for our next project, I guess.
So Marianne, I had mentioned the zoning text amendment maybe being something that you're interested in, but now that I'm hearing more, I think for housing safety, it's all about code enforcement. And the city has a staffing shortage right now. The mayor, his Office of Management and Budget issued a memo in October saying that they're freezing hiring for many agencies and permanently reducing headcounts. We know that the housing agency is 500 staff short of their budget. And this is absolutely impacting code enforcement in the city. So I think advocacy around the city reinstating their staffing at the housing agency would also be great. Maybe your group would think about sending a letter to the mayor around that, and we'd be happy to help include some of the stats around the cuts if that's of interest. And then, the other opportunity I mentioned in the chat was around the city's zoning text amendment. There will be a series of proposals that will be discussed at a community board level. So it's really important for people to come out and be pro-housing. The things that we care about in that discussion is a new affordable housing density bonus. It would allow any affordable housing to be built at a slightly higher density. And that allows affordable housing developers to compete with the market more. And it allows us to squeeze a few more affordable homes out of every project that moves forward. So that's a really important opportunity. We need local voices. In that is also reducing or eliminating parking requirements. I think for our city to be a sustainable one as well, we really need to rethink encouraging car use in the city. So we've done, the city has made some changes around mass transit to eliminate the requirement, but we're still requiring it in many parts of New York City. And that also adds to the cost of building housing. So those are kind of the two big things we'll be looking for in that zoning text amendment process.
I guess what I'm really is, getting more specific info, about, so I can bring this back to the group and, and share just.
So yeah, on the zoning text amendment, we're going to have information out in early 2023. The public engagement process will start in the spring. So some of it isn't quite there yet. I sent you a link in the chat. Just some, general, there's just some general info there. But if you email me, I would help you draft that letter.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
I'm just, I guess it's housing but really the racial structures that make for, things, the zoning laws, everything, and and all the things that you spoke about, Laura, too, so, I mean, Long Island is not the Bronx, but the Bronx has, challenges too, so we're the poorest borough in the city, and, so.
And when you look at all of these housing policies, it's always communities of color who are the most impacted. If you cut code enforcement, it's going to be the largest number of violations are in our lowest income neighborhoods, which are also highly concentrated communities of color. And that's where the negative impact is going to happen. I mean, the same for the zoning bonus. If we can build more housing, that's going to benefit everybody. So
Okay.
Can I also say something, Marianne, really quickly? As a former housing attorney in Brooklyn, I live in Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn. And as someone who worked in New York City's Department of Education and knows the Bronx very well, I do want to note that Katie's push is really important. Part of what the city did under de Blasio, aside from the developing stuff, was invest in providing free civil counsel in housing cases. But what it did was it was very specific in terms of the subsidized rent regulations and the type of counsel and that you could provide. So a lot of people who were living in unregulated housing were not afforded representation. And frankly, on the state level, what we've seen over the years is the erosion of protections under rent regulations, whether it be rent stabilization and that sort of thing. So I think there's something to be said, not only about the provision of free counsel to all tenants, but also taking a look at our rent stabilization regulations and the protections that are not there for renters. I mean, we talk about New York City being a rent, landlords will tell you that they feel renters, tenants are more protected, but the reality is that it is, it's far easier for landlords with their plethora of attorneys to certainly get their tenants out or take apartments off the market until they can get what they want. So I think that there's a piece of, there's some advocacy that needs to happen around that as well.
Okay, thanks.
I second the plug for Marianne to join up with Katie and push her right to council. It's been such a huge impact. And I know, Katie, you had in your presentation our number of homeless in New York at 92,000 statewide, but that number would be so much higher if we did not have right to counsel in New York City. It's a really important thing to continue to fight for.
Deborah, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I posted a question about an hour ago, so I apologize because the conversation has really kind of moved off this topic, but I was wondering if there are any current models for housing or advocacy groups working with communities to successfully integrate affordable housing initiatives, whether anything in anybody can point to anything in New York or maybe any other state or someplace where I could do some reading about that.
Can you say a little more about what you mean?
Well, I'm thinking of you know, it's a very sort of variation on the NIMBY question, like how, are there any communities, any projects, initiatives where a housing group or community group has actually successfully integrated affordable or supportive housing, kind of, you know, just successfully dealt with community opposition where a project was actually able to go through.
Good.
Well,
Rachel, if I could just pick up on that, at your conference last couple weeks ago, you recognized 3 groups of people who I'd never heard of, who are trying to organize folks to counter NIMBYism.
Yeah, so I can find the video and send it. It's a really great video to get a sense of their work. There's the Welcome Home Westchester campaign in Westchester, and they're a kind of multi-sector coalition pushing for more housing. And there is East End YIMBY in the East End of Long Island, educating community members to come out and fight for housing at the local level. And they successfully passed a referendum for housing investment in the East End of Long Island. And the core of their work was around you know, workers in their towns not being able to afford living anywhere near their jobs, and really getting to the heart of that matter. And then we also included in that Open New York, who comes to New York City community board meetings and fights for housing. I'm also going to just put in the chat this gallery we have. We do this every year, Community Impact Gallery. These are amazing projects, either in design or happening around New York State. And it'll give you a sense of like this is happening. There are lots of wonderful projects happening, really high impact, engaging with communities across the state. So you could have a look at some of those.
Great, thank you.
Neil Barry, are you still here? I think you had your hand up.
I was just interested in that. I've never had, you know, a conversation when it comes to compassionate care. Maybe some of the advocacy around housing as a human right. You know, I think that conversation is needed, you know, in the compassionate care, not just the fulfillment of the law, but as a human right. I just wanted to throw that out there.
I think that we live in this space of commodification where, you know, housing is not seen as a right, but something that's, you know, only certain people can afford. And until we've sort of made that shift as a society, you know, we're going to continue to really struggle, I think. Okay, Dahlia Herring has your hand up.
Yes, let me make sure. Yeah, I see that Alan Martin asked about immigrants coming to not just New York City, but all of New York State. And I just wanted to let people know that the State Council of Churches will be having a seminar on immigration issues on January 17th from 7 to 9 p.m. and housing will be one of the topics. So just wanted to mention that. But that issue, and the way I look at it is that what happened when there was that immediate busing, primarily of Venezuelans into New York City, and actually ended up some of them in Albany, where I come from, is, to me, that was the canary in the mine, because suddenly you had an influx of people who were basically homeless, and we have to make sure that is integrated in all of our housing policies. Thank you.
And if I could just quickly add on to that, Dahlia. When we talk about the Housing Access Voucher Program, for instance, we need to be sure that that is accessible to non-citizens, to undocumented people as well, and always be asking that question with any of our housing policies: is this accessible to non-citizens? So we'll be looking at that question as well. Okay, we're going to just go a couple minutes over here briefly. Mark had a question. Alan
Well,
had a
I just,
question.
yeah, I wanted to respond to Neil's point about compassionate conduct, and just wanted to say that we've been in a conversation with Pastor Gil Monrose at the Mayor's Center for Faith-Based and Community Partnerships about that very idea, developing a code for compassionate conduct, particularly for agencies and individuals that engage with those who are homeless. It's a long-term project, but it's a conversation that we've started because we certainly feel that that anyone who's working with the most vulnerable needs to abide by certain codes. And actually, there's a pretty good amount of receptivity among a lot of the housing emergency service providers. So it's a long-term project, but it is something we've started to talk about.
Okay, and Alan.
Thank you, Dr. Cook, for such a very informative, engaging session today, along with your colleagues and all those who presented today. My question is, I just want to piggyback on what I asked a little earlier. I received a letter from Gil Monroe's office in regards to houses of worship, providing housing space for the new immigrants who are coming to the city. I just got that on yesterday. And I was wondering how, what's the programs to help the churches with this? Because they're asking us if we have space, that we can accommodate families, where we can house them. I imagine it's going to be temporarily, especially as the temperature changes and winter's upon us. They're looking for places for these people to go. And I think a lot of churches would like to help, but they may not have the funding or whatever needed to actually provide a place of comfort for the people. They may have buildings that need a little work or some sort of adjustment to it. At least something has to be done so that it can be properly suitable for a family or a group of people that may have to stay there throughout this winter. I was just wondering about that.
Dr. Foley?
So thank you for that. Rachel or Mark, I think you might have a pretty pointed response to that question. I got that letter yesterday and actually wrote to Peter Gudaitis, who from the New York State Interfaith Disaster NIDIS. I never get the acronym.
New York State Disaster Interfaith Services.
Yeah, it's just like, hey, you're asking congregations to, provide this, but, you can't just give us a few bucks for linens. We need a little more substantial help than that. So
let me respond. Yeah, if I could. Yeah, because I'm actually in conversation now with the deputy mayor about this, and Peter and I spoke about this, and Gil and I spoke about this. And it is a challenge that the city is not necessarily acknowledging what it will take for congregations to respond quickly. And so we're going to have to, there's a very high, very steep mountain that we need to climb to ask congregations to take this on without putting them in significant financial jeopardy. So it is a work in progress, and I will keep everyone posted. I just arranged a meeting with the deputy mayor to try to tell her what Gil and I talked about. What Peter and I talked about. It is going to be a very, very difficult climb. The city has needs. Where are the resources? Can they guarantee that congregations won't be caught in the middle? And where are the federal resources that are supposed to be coming to deal with this crisis? So it is a mess. Let's see if we can make some sense of it in the short run and in the longer run.
Okay. I think we are going to need to conclude, but I just want to give Rachel one more parting shot here.
I think Rachel left.
Oh, she did.
I think so,
Okay.
yeah.
Hey,
She had
Peter,
another meeting.
can I say
Yeah.
something?
Can you-
One, I want
yeah.
to thank you for hosting this. Two, I also want to remind all of the people here that we have an opportunity and a duty to kind of help people think differently about who our most vulnerable populations are and the support that we can offer them, and also who are the people that need support. And I hope that as we go into the holiday season, we just kind of remember this. And as we think about the new year, we continue to focus on the roles that churches and institutions of faith can play in helping people, in transforming people's mindsets and thinking around this important topic. I just want to say thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, I really appreciate everybody sticking with this conversation today, particularly the topic of affordable housing is very complex and multi-layered. We're going to gather up all of these comments and work on our own legislative ask around affordable housing, which will be rolled out on our advocacy day, which will be evening of September 27th and the day of February 27th and 28th in Albany. And it really will focus on both immigration and housing. So,
And also remember Tuesday, we're doing a workshop. I don't know if you
oh,
announced
yes,
that.
I'm sorry, forgive me. And then we have a very specific workshop on housing vouchers, which will be next Tuesday at 4 o'clock for us to really dig in deep into that particular topic, because vouchers are probably one of the most cost-effective and humane ways we can immediately address the housing crisis, but there's a lot of complications with current vouchers and getting more vouchers into the market. All right.
Yeah.
Well,
So do
thank
you have a link for
everyone.
that, Peter? Do you have a link that you can share? that?
I do.
Great.
Um,
Yeah, while Peter's looking for it, just the point is that landlords are often resistant to taking voucher holders, and we feel it's because the voucher holders aren't coming with support that the landlords feel confident that the voucher holders will be good tenants. So we're trying to bridge that gap, and we'll be talking about that on Tuesday. And so anyone who has access to landlords or who is interested in vouchers or wants to advocate, please join us. It should be a very interesting conversation.
yeah, that's great. So I'm just putting that in the chat right now, and then and then we will conclude. So thank you, everybody, for staying a couple minutes past. I know Rachel wanted to stay, but she had to be on a meeting at noon, and I'm sure others of you have to be on with your days. So thanks, everyone, for your help. And I'll leave the chat open for a few minutes if you want to copy things.